Today, well, we'll cover as much as we can. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where I latest post covering finance and property news. It's another Friday. Tarric Brooker's with me. Hi, Tarric.
G'day, Martin. How are you, mate?
I am fine, but boy, there's so much going on. We could make a 12-hour show and still not cover it all.
Certainly, mate. I mean, even if we just focused on some little microcosm, like the long end of the bond market, like long duration bonds, and the impact of the Bank of Japan's changes and how that's all sort of just spiraling through global markets and even impacting the Australian dollar, like you said, we'd be here for 12 hours.
Yeah, it is crazy. And what I find fascinating, Tarric, is that the narrative earlier in the year was US is going to go into recession. It's going to be pretty bumpy, and then of course the market sort of no, maybe it won't be. And so up until a few weeks ago, everything was going. The markets were going up, the bonds were actually looking okay, but then suddenly it's like the mood music has changed dramatically, and then all of this other data that started to come in over the top, because of course central banks are now being, quote, data driven, and guess what? You end up with this huge amount of distortion in the market, and people trying to navigate their way through this really, really foggy environment. And then of course China says, oh, actually our economy isn't going quite so well, and we're going to stop reporting unemployment amongst young people because we don't like the numbers. And then they're encouraging some of the financial players there to not manipulate the market, but to be selective in the way they operate in the market. And then of course we have Evergrande saying, oh, we're going to actually have to do a protective bankruptcy proceeding in the US. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up.
No. And if we went into detail, we'd be here all day. It's crazy. I mean, even if you just look at, like, say, for example, the Netherlands recently moved into join Germany and some of the other, European nations in recession. And it's just crazy just how disparate outcomes are. Because in Europe, you've got this sort of, budding recession. You've got this big economic slowdown occurring in the UK, despite inflation and wages picking up. And then in China, in China, if you according to some people, the wheels are absolutely coming off. And then in the US, you've got the Atlanta Fed saying, you know what? The GDP might grow by 5.8%. Admittedly, this is an annualized figure for Q3. So in a lot of ways, this is actually sort of a bit like that perfect storm that you and I have talked about in the past, where the US stays strong, which keeps rates high, but China slows down, which hits Australia, and China doesn't import as much, which also hits Australia. And the Australian dollar is in a very exposed place because of the differential between Australian yields and US bond yields. So the RBA and Australia more broadly are in this really, really dodgy position, whereby the longer this business cycle goes on, the more likely it becomes that Australia ends up importing inflation due to a weaker currency. And, well, if China doesn't stimulate, we could end up having a really bad time.
Yeah, and I have a view that for some time that China's stimulation, if they do it this time, will be different, and it will be perhaps more targeted. So it'll be less on the let's just build more stuff. And it's interesting because some of the mood music coming out of China is much more about we need to get more equitable outcomes for people in China and those sorts of things. And so there's just such a different tenor. And on the data, I keep coming back to this quite interesting observation, Tarric, that if you look at some of the data that's being presented, take for example the latest unemployment data from Australia, right? So the unemployment went up, but when you actually look at it, it went up not a lot. But there are at least three reasons why those numbers moved around, and yet, of course, most people ignored the reasons. For example, holidays. For example, the sampling errors and a few other bits and pieces too. And the survey, as it moves on each time, they drop people and bring new people in, and that's moved the numbers around. But it amazes me how then the in the mainstream it's always, well, whoopee, that shows that the RBA is never going to lift rates again, and I'm thinking, yeah, but look at these broader trends with regard to inflation. We are not isolated on Australia. We are part of this global thing that's going on, and the global machine is, well, a couple of cylinders are firing really, really fast, but the other two cylinders are hardly firing at all. And to use your driving analogy, it could end in tears.
Yeah, I think we're in a really interesting sort of scenario in that regard. I mean, here in Australia, you look at, say, for example, the NAB business surveys, the AIG, various PMIs for services, construction, manufacturing. All of them are showing renewed price pressures, and in some cases, price pressures at the highest level that we've seen them so far on some of these sub-indices. So we're at this really awkward crossroads that could, well, in a lot of ways, at least based on the headlines, be called stagflation, because you've got inflationary pressures becoming entrenched in certain sectors, and then you've got other sectors showing that slowdown. But one of the interesting things I think with the unemployment is I first off on the seasonally adjusted side, I concur with you. I think that this is the sixth time this has happened in the last 18 months that we've had this big sample rotation related move. And I think it's probably like the last 5 times that we'll see the seasonally adjusted number roar back in the next couple of months. But if you look at the trend data, which someone made a really good point about on Twitter, the unemployment rate is rising based on the trend data, but at a very, very low rate. It's only risen from about 3.5 to about 3.63%. So it's not moving at the speed of light by any stretch of the imagination. But because the labor force is growing at such a rapid rate, the working age population grew by 50,000 people in the last month's worth of data, and 500,000 people over the last 12 months. So I think it's worth noting that even if we manage to have relatively robust jobs growth, say 10, 15,000 jobs a month, which is still, pretty good jobs growth for an economy of our size, which sort of, if you put that into US numbers, you're talking about sort of like 200, 220, 250, 300,000. So good, solid numbers. That would still see us with a sort of 5%-ish unemployment rate in the next 18 months. And if we started seeing like just zero jobs growth, 12 months from now, we could be looking at an unemployment rate with a 6 handle, even though nothing has really gone that badly wrong yet.
Absolutely. And the other point, of course, is, this is all a lagging indicator, right? It takes time for all of these things to flow through. And I chuckle about people saying, "Oh, there's no mortgage cliff. We're not seeing anything." I know we're going to talk about that in some detail, because this is a really important factor too. But I'm looking at some of the insolvency data, particularly in the construction sector and more broadly, and there are some really, really quite concerning forward-leading indicators. And I was talking to an insolvency practitioner the other day who was saying they've never been busier, and they've got this huge pipeline now of firms that are actually up against it. Interestingly, a lot of the seeds for their destruction were actually created through COVID. And so it's the fallout from COVID that's actually ultimately creating the problem now. And his observation was that the real insolvencies relating to the interest rate rises, he's not expecting to see those until the middle of next year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I wrote an article on the impact of, the mortgage cliff, which I'll get you to link in the description, which, did a bit of a case study comparing people coming off teaser rates in the US, in the Big Short era, just prior to the financial crisis, and what it's like for someone today. And, here in Australia with the mortgage cliff, and the increase in repayments for the US borrower was around about, off the top of my head, about 38%. You can check it in the article. But for an Australian borrower, their repayments are increasing. If they got an average fixed rate mortgage in June of 2021, and they just had it roll off just at the end of the previously gone financial year, their payments would increase by 67%. Now that's based on the average variable rate. There are people who are rolling off these loans onto significantly higher rates because they didn't end up, negotiating with the bank. They've just rolled off and just, sort of forgotten about it. But I just think that just goes to show that this is a really, really serious issue. And it's all well and good for people to say, "Oh, nah, everything's fine. So far nothing's gone bad." And I just feel like saying, well, it's not that hard to keep the plate spinning for 12 months. anyone who's done some basic preparation, who has a relatively basic level of intellect, can put together a strategy to keep the wolves away from the door, especially when, for some people, at least what I've heard anecdotally, is all you need to do is ring up the bank and say, you know what, I'm having a really hard time at the moment, this is really all stressing me out, so could you just put the loan on pause for a bit? And for some people that works.
Yeah, there are definitely people who are being helped by the bank, and as you say, put the loan on pause or go interest only or extend the term. A lot of that I'm seeing in my surveys. But did you see the Christopher Joe article on Livewire? He was talking about the delinquencies, and he's noted that the delinquency rates, particularly in the so-called prime non-bank lending, are rising quite fast. And he's saying, well, that's a sort of a forward indicator. I'm seeing the same in my data. Not all households are traveling at the same rate, but we're already starting to see some early cracks beginning to show. And again, I highlight to everybody my mortgage stress, which is a cash flow measure. It's very early. It's nothing to do with people falling over directly. Never been higher, which suggests to me that we are going to see considerable pressures down the track, but it's going to take a bit of time.
Yeah, I think Joy made an interesting point on that, and so did one of the spokespersons at Pepper Money, who basically said, well, how do I put this diplomatically? Basically, we don't fudge the numbers. We give you exactly what's happening when it's happening. There's no sort of like adjusting for things and adjusting for hardship. It's like if we say this many people are in arrears and this many people are in hardship, that's how many people there are. We're not in any way influencing or using any of these other tools or other mechanisms that APRA has provided, or that the banks have provided to themselves to be able to change these numbers. And that's, I think, part of the reason why we're seeing this surge in arrears in even the prime borrower categories of these other smaller non-bank lenders who don't have those same level of options as compared with the major banks who are saying, well, arrears have only risen relatively marginally. But I just think it's worth noting that during the rate hike cycle prior to the GFC in the US, rates rose by 4% from 1.25 to 5.25%, which is roughly where they are today. And during that 2-year period, from the start of the rate rises, US mortgage arrears rose by 0.02%. So despite the fact that all these people were coming off teaser rates, all these people were having a relatively bad time of things, and rates were rising relatively rapidly for the 25% of American household debt that was exposed to floating rates, things didn't begin to fall over. It took time. If you come back 2 years later, well, it was quite a different story.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, as I keep saying, it takes a long time. And I see that in my surveys, right? So people were actually getting into difficulty a few months ago in terms of mortgage stress. But they can do things. They can throttle back their spending. They can put more on credit cards. They can restructure and refinance. All of those things are potentially there. So, people also can work more hours. So one of the interesting observations on the, the employment data, more people are working more hours to be able to actually generate a little bit of marginal income to be able to cover the increased cost. And you can do that for a period. But as I said in my show yesterday, the engines eventually get to the point where you can't spin them any faster. And that's why I think that we are going to see some significant issues. But it will take time. And again, a lot of people are assuming that the worst is through. Everything's going to be fine now, and home prices are going to start bulging higher again. And the government announcements this week on housing will save everybody. Not. So it's amazing. We should get into the slides, Tarric, or we'll never start.
We probably should. Okay. As always, all of the various charts are available at avidcom.substack.com. I would like to thank the DFA viewers for the messages and for their various contributions. They are very, very much appreciated. And without further ado, we shall get right into the slides. Now, we had quite a few questions recently on negative gearing and a request to look at it in rather too much detail. So here we are in rather too much detail, and we're going to really get into a little bit into the nitty-gritty of what the data from the ATO and what some of the predictive data from the Parliamentary Budget Office, which is sort of like the Congressional Budget Office in the US. So they're an independent body who basically does costings for political parties at request. But we'll just get to this first chart. Now, basically, it shows that for the history of data that the ATO has for the vast majority of that time prior to the pandemic, landlords were losing money in aggregate. So despite the fact that there are a lot of landlords who are positively geared, people who have properties that have no debt, that in aggregate, they were still losing money. Now, as rates fell significantly, they actually moved to a position in the 2020-2021 financial year where they were actually making money for the first time since the records on this began.
Yeah, Tarric, and the point there is that the interest payment and the interest burden is such a critical element in all of this. And if you look at it from a distributional perspective, as I've highlighted several times with my surveys, there are a lot of investors who are completely underwater. So they never make anything at all. Now, I look at it before any tax breaks that you might get, because that's the only way to do it. So for some of those, what they're doing is offsetting those losses against other income. So net, it's a different story. But this shows you that property investing is a hostage to interest rates.
Yeah, it is. And it's also the fact that despite the fact that there's this enormous mass of investors who've owned properties for decades and decades who basically have a license to print money, that they're offset by all these other people who are just losing money hand over fist week after week.
Yeah, and don't we feel good about as taxpayer, supporting these poor, hard-working property investors with all of these tax breaks and all these other incentives? Doesn't it make you feel good?
Oh yeah, it just, particularly as a member of a younger demographic where our home ownership rates are so low, and my taxes are going to support the tax concessions of people who own multiple homes when there are millions of us who don't even own one. So yes, it's going very, very well.
Yeah. And I just want to make the point, if you look at the distribution of how many people have one property, two properties, 5 properties, 8 properties, 20 properties, right? There are a lot of people with multiple investment properties and have multiple negative gearing schemes against them. So they are getting huge amounts of tax handouts relative to your average Australian who can't even afford to get one property to live in.
Yeah, I think it's even just worth noting that I don't have the chart for this, but maybe I'll bring it up in the next week, next time we have a show. But the Commonwealth Bank distribution of lending by income for property investment, and I think about 60, maybe over 60% of total investment property lending flows to households with incomes over $200,000, with the overwhelming majority flowing to households in the top 5% of income earners. So I think this idea it's all mums and dads. It's like, well, no, it's really not.
Spot on. That's right. I mean, there are some mums and dads there, although in fact some of those mums and dads have already exited the market, because remember, there's about 25% less property investors now than there were 2 or 3 years ago, simply because the economics don't work anymore for many. So, but there are other people who actually have huge portfolios, but then if you look at their income distribution and their tax support, it's just all out of kilter. This is crazy. Anyway, we should get on to the next slide, or again, we will never finish.
No, I think you make an interesting point there, because even though there are in some cases fewer investors, the properties are being gobbled up by other investors.
Yes.
So it's just leading to this increasing concentration of wealth. But that's Australia. Okay, now this is from 2000 onwards, the proportion of tax-paying landlords who are negatively geared. Now, I assume that there are other landlords who are not Australian taxpayers, so take that with a slight pinch of salt because of foreign landowners, etc. But as it shows, again, basically, peak in interest rates, peak in number of tax-paying landlords who are negatively geared. Interest rates fall. But even with interest rates at their lowest level in history, almost half was still negatively geared. Now, I don't know about you, but just the sort of old school cash flow based investor in me doesn't really find that all that appealing.
Well, I tend to agree, but maybe I am old school, or maybe I just think that if the purpose of if the purpose of investing is to minimize your tax, I have a problem with that.
Yeah, especially when everyone else has to pay for it.
Correct. Exactly.
All right, now we'll move on to the big one. How much does negative gearing actually cost? Now, what we have, that's the actual cost of negative gearing over time. Now, that is from a formula derived from one from Philip Sues, who helped me out on producing some of the data for this. And basically, it just shows that over time, negative gearing during the lower rate era has cost somewhere between $2 and $3.5 billion a year. Now you can see that sort of rather big jump there of the higher rate era. Now that is from the Parliamentary Budget Office, and they found that negative gearing for this current financial year should end up costing about $7.6 billion. So that's quite a lot of money. It's quite a big jump. And it's also worth noting that that's only based on the cash rate this year being 2.85%, which it isn't. It's 4.1%. So that entire cost period that we have there out to all the way to 2030 is based on a 2.85% cash rate. So if it ends up staying higher, the bill could be significantly larger. But it's also just worth noting, just a little interesting fact, that for this financial year, the government will forego more revenue on negative gearing than it will spend on the entire foreign affairs budget, which includes every cent we will spend on foreign aid and consular assistance to Australians overseas in trouble.
And it puts the $3 billion, is it? The housing investment fund, or the $10 billion that they're going to put into it. I mean, it puts it in context, right? So they're actually almost paying out as much into negative gearing this financial year as they're proposing to tip into this, inefficient and rather misplaced housing fund.
Yeah, I mean, if they just turned around and spent $7.6 billion and, indexed that into inflation and spent that on social housing, well, damn, they'd actually make a dent in the thing.
Exactly. Exactly.
I think that's the thing, that gets me, and we'll get to this. Actually, you know what? We'll just get to the next slide here. Now, this is of a study that was done by Melbourne University, which they submitted to and then discussed with the RBA during one of their workshops. And basically, it shows that home ownership's rates rise by about 4.3% under the removal of negative gearing in their modelling. Now, we've all had a great time with modelling since 2020. It's all been really, really fun. But I think that it's actually a relatively ballpark estimate of where things would go. Now, they do estimate that it would increase rents. But if the government has $7.6 billion a year more to spend on social housing. Now, admittedly, this is an ideal world scenario, but let's just run with it for a minute. They would more than counteract that increase in rents, in my view, if they were to spend $7.6 billion indexed to inflation, indexed to costs every year. I think somehow we'd be all right.
Mm. Well, it is just worth, 7 point something billion, right, per annum, relative to 10 billion once going into a future fund that's going to actually create, a small proportion of that in subsequent years that then can be invested in building housing. I mean, it just gives you a little bit of a relative sense of the quantum.
It does. And I think the thing as well is that these numbers that they're talking about, I mean, I wrote an article about this a few weeks ago for news.com.au, and the numbers don't add up. Even if you take all of their estimates at face value. Now, I contacted the PM's office, I contacted Treasury about this to get their best case scenario of what they think will happen when they spend this money. Now, never mind that, you're talking in some cases about getting entire social housing units for 170 grand each. Now, whether or not, that can actually happen, talk to your builder mates, they'll tell you exactly how viable that is. But it just, even if we take those numbers at face value, it's not going to keep up with population growth and the growth in dwelling stock. So social housing growth is basically going to be next to nil in aggregate terms, in terms of the proportion of overall housing stock, and it doesn't really add up. But nobody's saying that.
Well, we're saying it, and I have there's been a few political satire programs around the place, Utopia in Australia and, Yes Minister in the UK, right? And it's all about announceables, right? It's all about saying something which sounds as though we're doing something even when we're not really doing much at all. And I would class this whole housing stupidity over the last couple of weeks as, well, in the end, we got some announceables, but that's all.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, like for example, at the mid-year budget last year, they announced, well, an announceable that they were going to build 1 million new homes over the next 5 years. Now, they come up well short of that. They only built 173,000 in the first period following that. So, it was never going to get to 100. Coming back from that level of deficit to then build 1 million would be, a Herculean task. So instead of just going, well, we didn't really meet what we were going to do, and we really need to rethink that, they turned around and they've gone, you know what? No, we're going to build 1.2 million new houses, but it's not going to start until the 1st of July next year. So we've moved the goalpost, we've raised the target, and it's not going to be a target that is actually going to be meaningfully assessed for another 2, maybe 3 election cycles. And all of a sudden, hey presto, our failure has been papered over.
And then they can blame everybody else but themselves, and there'll be another reason why they didn't quite make it, and so we go on. And I just come way back to that negative gearing number, right? And the stupidity that we've seen over the last couple of weeks with what they're doing, and it's chalk and cheese. I mean, there is a way forward here if they were wanting to really do something.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure if you saw it today, that tweet from Cameron Murray, basically saying, we could fix this, but this is what I've spoken to with political staffers, and they say, well, we don't want housing prices to fall.
Yeah.
We could, I find it ironic here in Australia, without going off on too much of a political rant. I'll try and keep this brief as humanly possible. But we've been running, this big Australia, immigration policy now since 2006, 2007. So what's that? 16 years, 17 years now. We've been running, the same housing policies here in Australia for over 20 years. Now, is it not that difficult to look at these things and go, well, that isn't working. Housing isn't more affordable. Maybe we should change things. Or hey, the wait times at ERs keeps going up. We don't have the resources to support the existing population. Maybe that should influence immigration policy. No, that doesn't happen. It's literally, like the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Absolutely right. And that's something which I've been saying over the years. There's enough evidence to say that over the last 30 years, the policy settings and the interventions that have been executed, look at first home incentive programs, look at the state incentive programs, look at all the other stuff, has failed miserably. And by the way, the international data also shows it doesn't work. And yet nobody actually wants to zig rather than zag. Everybody wants to just keep on with we've got to let the free markets be the free markets, and then we'll do a bit of intervention, and then we've got to be seen to be doing the right things. It's a set of cards that they've got which are deliberately designed not to solve the real issue.
Have you ever seen the film Idiocracy by any chance?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, there's a scene early on in the film where there's a guy with a square-shaped block trying to jam it into a circle-shaped hole.
Yes.
And I feel like that's our politicians. They just go, "Why doesn't it work?" And yeah, they just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And then there's the Productivity Commission and everyone else going, "This doesn't work. Why are you doing it? Why are you wasting this money?" But they don't listen.
No. And interestingly, of course, there were some backbenchers over the last couple of cycles, even people inside the the conservative side of politics who were in power at the time, who were saying, this doesn't work, this isn't working. And I had conversations with a number of them, but they had no way of breaking through, because within the sort of the senior echelons of those making the decision, from the PM and the Treasury down, this was the religion that couldn't be questioned.
Yeah, I've had similar conversations myself with MPs, with senior people in the sort of party, within the party itself, not the political party, the actual organization, rather than the party in Canberra. And I've had they say the same thing, and it's ridiculous. They keep thinking that this is what people want, or at the very least, this is what what the donors want, enough to be able to, for them not to push back. Because if you really rock the boat, then all of a sudden they're going to back the other side. And I think Labor's shown recently that they can be quite friendly to those sorts of people.
Well, there's no difference really between the two sides of politics on this. But what I would remind everybody in the political sphere, there is a demographic question coming up, right? Because if you look at the distributional, from an age perspective, over the next few years, there are going to be more people in the younger age groups, the people who are not able to access the housing market, the people who are actually being disadvantaged by these current structures, whereas there's going to be a falling off the perch at the other end. So by definition, at some point, the political class has got to wake up to recognize that the landscape is changing under them. It's a question of when will it happen and which party will actually jump first.
Well, I think the ball, I think, is in the coalition's court in that regard, because they are the ones who suffer the most from a lack of home ownership. Renters tend, the Australian National University election survey shows this quite nicely, that renters tend to vote Greens or Labor, overwhelmingly versus the coalition, whereas homeowners have historically favoured the coalition because if you've got something to conserve, you're more likely to be a conservative. But, for a lot of young people, they don't have anything worth conserving. They're just like, well, stuff it. Why should I support a system that doesn't support me? And that's a perfectly understandable approach, I think. And I think that the Liberal Party in particular really need to realise that they're shooting themselves in the foot by continuing to pursue the status quo.
Yeah, and it also explains the Green Party policy, right? Because effectively, I think they a few years ago identified the renting sector and the voters in the renting sector as potentially an addressable market for them, which is one of the reasons why they're pulling the levers they're pulling.
Yeah, and, it's just for a little bit of Machiavellian realpolitik for a moment. The current status quo grows the ranks of renters, which benefits them. So, you kind of got to ask: is there sort of some Machiavellian sort of approach in there, thinking we don't really want to solve things, because if we do solve them, those voters might think about voting teal, or they might think about voting for a socially progressive but economically conservative Liberal member. So, there's that too.
And in the meantime, they can say, well, see, we've been very vocal with regard to renters and the interests of renters. So that they can play it both sides of the middle, even if they don't really want the outcome that they're actually going for.
Yeah, it's really quite clever. I mean, I think they're probably going to benefit from that at the next election. If Albo is silly enough to run a double dissolution over this, I don't think Labor's going to do too well against the Greens in some of those inner city seats.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. Now, people have said, but if they remove negative gearing, what's going to happen? Well, this is what's going to happen. New Zealand has wound down negative gearing. The proportion of housing finance flowing to investors has dropped, and the proportion flowing to first home buyers has risen. So, I think this just shows that we really, really need to keep negative gearing from avoiding this absolutely horrible sequence of events from occurring in Australia.
Mm. And and the point there, of course, is that as more people buy their own property, they come off the rental category into the ownership category. So this actually helps to alleviate some of the pressures on the rental sector as well. Yeah,
exactly. And, it also means that if you do start to see, prices drop as they have in New Zealand quite considerably, up to, 25, 26% in some regions. If prices drop so much, all of a sudden people go, well, you know what? I can afford to build a new home. Yeah, so I'm actually adding to housing supply. I'm actually helping to create a job or to keep a tradie in business. Yeah. Or I can, or prices have come down. Maybe I can afford to buy a property and I can renovate. So I'm actually helping the economy and doing something with it rather than it just flowing and sitting in someone's bank account.
Absolutely. Well, I've said consistently over many years, property is ultimately overvalued in Australia dramatically. And that's because of all the policy settings, right? There is no strategy that I can see that's going to solve this without letting property prices come back more towards more affordable right? And that means looking at a 30 to 40% reduction in prices. That's the dilemma, right? Because of course politicians, oh, we can't possibly, see that, and the banks will say, oh, financial stability, it'll create massive issues in our balance sheet. But the truth is, unless you allow property prices to come back closer to the long-term average, and New Zealand has done that, you're never going to find a way out of this maze.
No, it's only just going to get worse and worse and worse. And I mean, I've got an article coming out either this weekend or next weekend on, the rise and rise of the Australian property investor, and, there are 800,000 more Australians renting today than there would have been if the proportion of housing stock owned by investors had have stayed the same as it was back in 1995, 96. So, who has benefited from that? Like we've seen home ownership rates fall. So really, the actual people who are winning off this is actually remarkably small relative to the overall population, because through this entire time, property investors have, in aggregate, up until 2020, 2021, been losing money anyway in terms of cash flow.
Right. And the other interesting observation, Tarric, is if you do a pure piece of economic analysis on an investment property, including the acquisition costs and the disposal costs and the maintenance costs, even with price rises, in fact, on a net basis, most property investors are still underwater. So as an investment class, they're much less effective than many other asset classes from an investment perspective. And that's something that a lot of people don't want to recognize either.
No, but we should probably get on to the next slide, because now this is a slide that's probably unwelcome for quite a few people, and because it shows that Kiwi property prices over the last 2 months have been bouncing.
Yep.
And I have actually done a bit of an analysis on this, and what I've found is that Canada, New Zealand, and Australia have both seen, not both, have all seen property prices bounce at similar times following the reopening of borders in the case of Australia and New Zealand, and the ramping up of immigration well past historical norms in Canada. They've ranged from about between 9 and 11 months in terms of opening to property prices then bouncing. So I think this just illustrates nicely, something that you and I have mentioned, that once you drive high immigration into a rental crisis moment, eventually people are going to be incentivized to buy, especially, in these, and that is also having an outsized impact because of the fact that we do have such low stock levels and we do have such low levels of turnover. So that little bit of extra demand is having, a disproportionate impact. So, for the moment, at least, New Zealand, Australia have found this secret sauce, which is making millions of people miserable and forcing them to buy properties in order to support the housing market.
Well, it shows you that the ultimate objective is support the housing market at all costs. I mean, that seems to me to be the the hidden mantra behind the activity. We can't allow property prices to slide, and that's because, of course, as I said, financial stability, etc., and also the fact that no politicians want to be on deck when property prices fall.
Yeah, I mean, I feel particularly sorry for the Kiwis because, they were having it pretty good there. They had the same issues as us. They had the same issues with rents. But they actually had the price falls. And it got to the point in Auckland where rents were flat, where they'd gone through, they'd gone through this really challenging period during the pandemic. They'd seen the big uptick in rents that everyone has seen around the globe, but then they weathered it. Right, and rents got to the point where they were flat year on year, and then the Kiwi government decides we're going to open up the immigration spigot. They took net overseas migration on an annualized basis to its highest level in history, and all of a sudden rents in Auckland are rocketing all over again. So unlike Australia, who's never been given a breather because we went straight from rental crisis, locally derived rental crisis, to then rental crisis being exacerbated by a large increase in demand driven by migration, New Zealand had that lull where, oh, hey, things are actually pretty good, to just, oh, then things have gotten bad again. So, I just, it's sad, really. It's sad that people are not being put first by their governments, and, that their needs and their concerns are not being adequately addressed.
Well, it makes you ask about, well, what is government for in the first place, right? Which is a rather deep question that I don't think at the moment the answer is proving to be particularly beneficial for most most people in the countries that are being governed by them.
No. Okay. Canada housing prices. Now, Canada has taken the same approach. They accept. Well, what do I say about Canada? They have taken their, say for example, in Australia, our population growth rate has hit about 2% year on year. Now, that's very high by our standards and is overwhelmingly driven by immigration. Now, obviously, I think there's a fairly high chance that that's going to be taken revised higher in the coming weeks and months, as we see. And I'm just basing that purely on the data and the growth of the working age population in the ABS unemployment series. Because if that's growing by 500,000 people, then you can be pretty sure that immigration's not too far behind that overall. But in Canada, they took their population growth rate to almost 4%. So they have taken it absolutely to the moon. And yet, in the most recent data, despite the fact that this is the middle of summer and favourable based on seasonality, Canadian housing prices have started to fall again. So the question now is that have we seen that particular immigration-driven pop in prices start to fall away? Is this just a momentary blip, and we're going to sort of see more of an upsurge, or have people just got to the point where everyone who wants to rent, who wants to buy, has done so? Everyone who's moved home can, etc., etc. And we're now starting to see the Canadian market find a new equilibrium. Now, I'm not sure, but I think that's a rather interesting question.
It is a very interesting question, Tarric, and I'll tell you that in my surveys, I do actually have a cohort which are first-generation Australians, so people who've moved into the country, right? And what's interesting is that some of those are now the most exposed. So whether you're actually looking at those who went into the rental sector, or whether you're looking at those who went in and bought a property in recent times, in fact, their financial position is as adverse as anybody's. So I have a theory that maybe you open the doors and a lot of people come into the country, but then reality bites, and a little bit later, suddenly the attractiveness of the country eases back, and people realize that actually this is not necessarily as good a proposition as you might think, and so some people are having to sell. And some people are having to move from the rental property they've got into something much less salubrious. So I think there's a really interesting second-order dynamic here, which I'm not sure necessarily that the politicians are awake to yet. But it'll be really interesting to see whether, in fact, the Canadian story plays out elsewhere, I think it may well.
Well, based on my math, we're probably about 2 or 3 months away, 2 or 3 months lagging from where Canada is. And, recently Sydney has seen that deceleration. Melbourne has seen a deceleration in prices. So, maybe we will follow. Although an interesting point that someone made is that this chart is quite reminiscent of the traditional bubble chart, where you see the big peak, then it rises again with the return to normal. So we'll see if that ends up playing out.
Well, only because it depends on what policies the Canadian government runs with ahead, right? Because my understanding is that they've still got very high immigration there, and they're still pumping the gas, trying to keep the GDP up whilst still tackling the very high inflation they've got there. And once again, another example where inflation's come down, but it's looking as though it's getting rather gritty again. And now there's talk about maybe even more rate rises in Canada. So it will be fascinating to see how there's the interplay of all these things.
Indeed. And speaking of inflation, there's been a lot of discussion recently that, the RBA's over-tightened, the Fed's over-tightened, blah, 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 blah. Now, it's their job to over-tighten. I know that a lot of people don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. They, at the end of the day, to kill an inflationary cycle, the vast majority of the time, someone globally has to eat a recession to suppress prices and to suppress inflation. Now, this chart is of Australian inflation, and I've circled in red various instances of high inflation that have been killed off via either instance one, an Australian recession, instance two, the dot-com bubble and a US recession, number three, the GFC, and number four, the Eurozone debt crisis. And in each of those instances of higher inflation, with the exception of the 90s recession, Australia has been bailed out by somebody else. Now, it's possible that someone else globally is going to eat the recession for us. Maybe it'll be the Europeans. They're already having a bad time of things after all. But this time, it might be us.
It looks as though it's about time Australia took the hard medicine right directly, rather. But or will it be China, right? Because of course China potentially, if they start going through what they're going through at the moment, with the exchange rate and everything else, Chinese goods will be really, really cheap. But will that be a deflationary event, or will it actually create second order effects that actually could be inflationary? I mean, it's hard to know how it is, but someone somewhere has to actually pay, and that's the point, isn't it? So who's going to put their hand up and say it's us this time?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ray Dalio made an interesting point about that on Twitter earlier today, and he basically said that China needs to restructure its debts. It needs to, get in front of this thing and basically just ensure that it's, systemic stability, for things like local government and local government financing vehicles and all those things that are currently, sort of threats to the Chinese economy. But if they do that, they can't keep spending money on roads to nowhere to keep the plates spinning. And if they don't build their, the unproductive infrastructure, then there's not going to be anything anywhere, especially with the property sector continuing to slowly fall over, there's not going to be anywhere near enough demand to support all that steel making. Yep. And without all that steel making, some of Australia's biggest exports like iron ore and coking coal are going to get smashed into oblivion. So if they go down in that regard, they don't even need to go down, just their steel sector needs to go down.
Yep.
They're taking us with them.
Yep, absolutely. And, it's true. I think that the reason we didn't have a huge impact from the global financial crisis was partly we got our banks rescued by some of the stuff with the US and China's massive stimulatory program, which, as you say, ended up building roads to nowhere and property that nobody wants to buy. But this time it's different because China's in a completely different place, and therefore maybe the cards will fall differently, and maybe it's going to be a rather bumpy ride for Australia itself.
Yep, and that is something that we are going to get to right now. This is of a private data provider called KE Holdings of China's various different cities and how much prices have fallen since their peaks, from which they record as November 2018. Now, if you note the city of Xi'an, which is quite famous for its terracotta warriors and holds quite an interesting place in Chinese history, property prices are down over 25%. And even in other, like say for example, other cities like Dalian, Nanjing, Guangzhou, you're not talking about little minnow Chinese cities out in the middle of nowhere and what do they call it, Inner Mongolia and places like that. These are big gun, not quite, in some cases, not quite top tier, but, relatively top tier Chinese cities who have seen property prices fall rather significantly. And this is all prior, in a lot of cases, to the current issues, because property prices, at least according to the official statistics, aren't really falling all that rapidly. But according to this, they've taken quite a tumble.
Yeah, the official one is about 2.2%, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, quite a bit of a different ballpark, isn't it? Although, I mean, the thing is, China, like I was actually thinking of including a slide on this that was just a picture of a glacier, because that is emblematic of Chinese property turnover. I will have great grandchildren before some of these Chinese cities see 100% of property turnover. That's how low the level of liquidity actually is.
Hmm.
So, I think I think that in a lot of ways, it's just this black box of a thing where no one really knows what these things are worth. But that is one of the biggest problems for China, because if you've got a market where 70% of new property in 2018 was bought by people who already own at least one property, you've got an entire sector of the economy reliant on speculative demand. So, I mean, that makes Australia look like downright safe by comparison.
Right, and of course you've got the demographic problem in China. If you look at the forward population estimates, the number of people are not going to grow anything like they were some time back. So you've got the broader demographic shifts there, and you've got the concentration of debt, as you say, amongst many people who've got multiple properties. And then you've got property prices falling, and well, they did cut interest rates a little bit, but not necessarily I don't think it's going to be enough to have a significant impact. So, yeah, it'll be fascinating to see how the Chinese sort of property issue plays out, not only in China but more broadly as well.
No, I agree. I think this is a good chart. This one's from the Financial Times, and it basically just shows that China today is about as reliant on property as Spain was prior to the financial crisis, and we all know how well that ended.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the Chinese economy was a lot bigger than the Spanish economy. So on a global basis, what happens in China probably has more fallout compared with what happened in Spain.
Indeed, and I think it's just worth noting that even looking at some of the statistics from China's National Bureau of Statistics on things like forward housing demand.
Mm.
Now, obviously, you take these statistics with a bulk carrier worth of salt, but even looking at them purely at face value, they see Chinese property demand, the peak in Chinese property demand, well and truly in the rearview mirror.
Yep.
And that property demand is only going to continue to fall over time. And that's despite the fact that they've got quite an estimate for a sizable proportion of properties being rebuilt. No, sorry, new properties being built and other ones knocked down because, frankly, in some cases, the quality is garbage. But even with that boost from crap quality property being demolished and new property being built, the peak in demand for things like steel and all these other things for the Chinese property sector is in the rearview mirror.
But that also means the 20% of young people are unemployed. You can't go and give them jobs in the building and construction sector, right? So that's another road that's blocked.
No, exactly. And the problem as well is that the people who are unemployed, and a lot of them, they don't want those jobs.
No.
They want a job in teaching. They want a job in high-tech manufacturing. They want a job in software engineering or something like that. But the problem is that the jobs just aren't there in sufficient numbers. So they've created a real problem in that regard, because there's this more affluent group of Chinese youths who want this future, whereas less affluent youths who didn't go to university, who are just looking to get a job and put food on the table. So it's a very, very difficult problem to address for policymakers, because there's no magic wand where you can just throw money at the economy and get these people the jobs that they feel they're owed.
Right, which is why the whole concept of more equality in the country and social cohesion, that's become a really important thematic coming out of China and out of Chinese policymakers, because they recognise it's a big deal.
Well, I'm not sure if you saw them, but today there was some few quotes from Xi that I thought were particularly striking. And to sort of paraphrase, he's talking about the sort of issues with capitalism and with the consumerism of the West. And this was, sort of stuff that you would have expected out of someone like Brezhnev while he was smashing his shoe on the table. Not out of someone like Xi, who's sort of more wedded to the modern world. And if that's the sort of approach that they're taking, less focus on consumerism, more focus on nationalism, on, the sort of communist ideals and all that sort of stuff, that doesn't bode well, I think, for, Western investment, for, continued ties with China, and nor does it bode very well for these young people who are quite literally just being told to to bugger off back to the region, bugger off to the regions and get a job on a farm because you should be happy with that.
I
Now, that's
know.
not what I'm saying. That's what the Chinese government's saying, just for a point of clarification there.
Absolutely. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, it does come back to a whole question of, politics and social issues, which are huge, and then are entwined with this economic, conundrum where they've got massive amounts of debt and so many other issues too. So that's why I've got the view that we're not going to see China, charging to the rescue like we did through 2007, 2009. This time it's a very different scenario.
And if they do, if that scenario does occur, and I don't think it could be ruled out, if that does happen, I think it's just worth noting that that is them expending so much of the last of their ammo. It's not funny, and could lead to a much harder landing down the road, rather than if they just take the medicine now, take the slower economy, deal with the lost decade Japanese style. And I think the thing is that, Japan gets a lot of crap for the lost decade, but really, if you look at it from a quality of life perspective for the average Japanese, it really wasn't so bad if you want to compare it with all these other things. It sounds so horrible, but in some ways, I mean, by some metrics, Australia had a worse lost decade prior to COVID. Just had a worse period of real outcomes from about 2013 to now than Japan did during the lost decade. So taking the lost decade may not be that bad of an option.
Right, and because of course the lost decade included falls in home prices, but if you look at real incomes in Japan over that period, they were actually relatively sustained. And of course, with the high savings that were there previous, people were quite well supported. And I had a lot to do with Japan because I worked for a Japanese-owned company for a good number of years, and it was fascinating talking to the Japanese who actually said, it's nothing like as bad in the country as it's being reported through that period. So it's fascinating that maybe there's a route where, in fact, allowing property prices to fall and some of the other things that people can hardly ever think about actually could lead to a better outcome. But of course, that takes a certain degree of political leadership, which may be beyond the current incumbents in Canberra.
Well, I think there's a fairly good argument for that. But the question is that particular strategy beyond the incumbents in Beijing? And I think that could end up affecting us all quite a bit more in the end.
You're probably right, actually. Good point.
Okay. Now, this is a really interesting one. It's of new loans written in China, and it's basically dropped to this is new bank loans to its lowest level since the global financial crisis. Now, this is, as you can see from the chart, an extremely volatile series based on seasonality. But this is still a very, very bad result, and this isn't one of the times where it is especially low based on seasonality. So I think that's quite a chart. And I mean, at the end of the day, for better or worse, China and the rest of the world has an economy that runs on credit.
Yeah, and of course, it's worth just thinking that interest rates have been cut and cut and cut in China, very unlike Western countries. So, they've been trying to drop interest rates to try and encourage people to borrow more, and firms to borrow more, but it's not really working.
No, and I think this just goes to show that the People's Bank of China, in some ways, they're pushing on a string. You can cut rates and you can cut rates and you can cut reserve ratios and you can do everything that you want to try and stimulate credit growth. But unless people want to borrow, which they don't, you can't grow credit. So, there's a really sort of, sizable issue there, I think. And I think it also speaks to the psychology of Chinese businesses and the Chinese consumer, that they're not interested in a lot of cases in taking on that debt, even if you offer it to them on quite favorable terms.
And I guess the question for me is, what does that then say about, is it the 3 trillion shadow banking system in China that is hardly ever reported, and there's almost no statistics about, because no one knows what's going on there. That's completely opaque.
No, and I think is, that's the real layman risk in all of this. People say, layman this, layman that. That is the risk. because if something blows up in the normal everyday Chinese financial system, the People's Bank of China can run to the rescue, and just as they have recently with liquidity injections into the markets and stuff, they can easily just throw money at it and make the issue go away. But if you start to see the shadow banking sector blow up, especially because you're not likely to see, the signs of stress that you would in a normal bank or in any other number of normal financial institutions, if that really starts to go nuclear in the background, that is the mechanism by which all manner of Chinese businesses and households are funded. And if that really blows up in the background, it's something that's, if one of the China's major banks blow up, they can just throw enough money at it, throw enough liquidity at it, and it'll be fine. But how do you fix something that's so opaque, that's so much of a black box of interconnected webs of finance of all these different organizations that most people don't even know about? And I include myself in that, because frankly, 99.9% of people don't understand it. And what happens when all that goes nuclear? How do you fix that? I don't know. I don't know how you can fix that without it being ungodly levels of expensive and just basically a giant fire hose that just sprays yuan all over everything.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's one to watch because the amount of data is so limited, but the risk, I think, is getting quite high. And the cross leverage and the cross exposures, it's very like the global financial crisis problem all over again, where nobody knows what's inside the package.
Yeah, exactly. Except this time I say the package is even larger.
Correct, it is. Yeah.
Okay. Now, this I think illustrates one of the problems of unwinding the Chinese property bubble. Chinese real estate is the largest asset class on the face of the planet. Now, admittedly, in per capita terms, Australia is a lot larger, so we can take a little bit of solace in that. Realistically, it's not worth anything near that. I mean, a normal sort of ratio is about 200% of GDP, and China's GDP, 200% of Chinese GDP is nowhere near $62 trillion US dollars. So, even if you were to, sort of allow sort of bit of a, corruption developing world multiplier on that, and let's call it, 3 times China's GDP, it's still nowhere near that. There's still so much to unwind. And although, I mean, I guess if you're going to unwind something where the housing turnover rate is glacial and, sort of the previous, I mean, if you sort of look at it, for full turnover in some of these cities, you're talking about like 350, 370 years. So, I mean, I guess it's going to be a real problem for for those people who are as, distant to, James Cook as as we are, except in the other, except in the other direction.
Yeah, but it does put it in context, doesn't it? It just shows you how big the problem is. Massive, massive, massive. And the difficulty is, I'm not sure that there's a way to diffuse it. Sitting here, I can't think how you'd actually go about solving the problem.
No, and I know, in all likelihood, they probably won't. They'll probably just pretend that everything's fine, because the thing is, with low levels of liquidity and just saying to people, I mean, it's like recently, these property developers in some of these second tier cities turned around and they said, well, we're going to start selling some of these new developments at a 30% discount. And the government turned around and said, no, you can't do that, because if you do that, that's going to devalue all these other properties around, and that's very un-Chinese, and that's very, very bad. It's immoral, and you shouldn't do that. But it just goes to show that, where the true level of value actually lies. And also, what happens if you do continue to lie? As long as you lie and you keep lying and you keep, people could say, well, my property is worth X number of dollars, when in actual fact, it's worth a fraction of that. I mean, I saw an interesting article in the South China Morning Post recently about some of these third-tier Chinese cities where people were buying properties, nice, decent properties, like 2-bedroom apartments, for 10 or 20,000 US dollars.
Yeah. But, this whole idea about what is my property worth, and that, you could throw that question into Australia too, right? You don't know until you actually come to transact.
No, exactly. And, I think that's one of the interesting things here in Australia. If we do, like, so much of the current paradigm, the current status quo is built on low levels of turnover. It's built on low levels of stock and on the market. But what happens if you take that away? What happens if you all of a sudden have, more not entirely price insensitive sellers, but more, so shall we say, motivated sellers? For whatever reason that might be. Maybe it's property investors retiring. Maybe it's people getting into trouble because of rising rates or inflation or just the plain old garden variety economic downturn. What happens to the market then? Because if you look, Australia and the US, say during the financial crisis, are not comparable. Our level of housing turnover it's less than half of Australia's today is less than half of where theirs was. So they're not comparable markets at all. So bringing more supply to market is going to have a significantly greater impact on the Aussie property market than it did on the US property market at that time.
Yeah, and Edwin keeps making that point. If you look at the Sydney market, even a small increase in stock will have a very significant impact on prices. And the latest data coming out of CoreLogic shows that there seems to be an unseasonal uptick in listings coming on. So, we could be at the very early stages of something rather interesting. Who knows? Maybe the migration will support it, but maybe it won't. And if it doesn't take much to tip the markets into a very different place.
Indeed, and I think that Sydney example I think is a really interesting one, because we've gone from new listing numbers being significantly below the 5-year average to at the 5-year average to 22% above the 5-year average. So you really got to wonder, especially once we start hitting those times where, because okay, it's a lot of people are probably saying, well, it's winter, a couple of extra properties hitting the market isn't that big of a deal. But if that sort of ratio continues to rise and you see that ratio in spring, well, then you've really got a ball game on your hands.
You have. And did you see the Mark Boris article in news.com the other day? He was saying, watch 3 to 4 months, there could be quite a different story by then.
Yeah, I disagree with him that it's this sort of mortgage cliff and it's all panic stations and stuff like that. I don't think it's as severe as he's making out, but I think that it is there is a level of severity that I think is underappreciated, and there is a lot of people who are just incentivized to walk away. Shall we say? They're not being forced by the bank. We're not at that stage yet for a lot of people, but it's got to the point now where it's just like, what, stuff it. Do I really want to deal with the stress? Do I really want to deal with the banks and the phone calls and the sleepless nights when I can just walk away? I've got X amount of equity. It's not so bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're going to see some quite interesting trends emerging over the next 2 or 3 months. But I'm with you. I don't think it's going to be an absolute crisis, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit more of an uptick in terms of listings. I wouldn't be surprised to see prices beginning to sort of come back down a little. But I would make the point that we've still got first-time buyers who are very anxious to get in, and we've still got a lot of renters who are desperate to get in almost to buy anything to alleviate the rental crisis. And that's a factor that I think many people haven't really sort of got their head around yet.
No. For that particular data set, do you have different, is it one that you run on an ongoing basis? So you've seen the increase in the number of, or the proportion of people in those demographics looking to buy over time?
Yeah, I do have some time series, and I have them by different cohorts, including those who are in the rental sector. And, you can sort of parse the data out a bit. I'd have to do a bit of extra analysis, but that there seems to me to be a broadening of those in the rental sector. And if you ask the question why, it's simply because, one, they've been charged an arm and a leg in a recent rental increase, and two, they hate the uncertainty of being in the rental sector and not being in control, and not being able to lock in a longer term lease, maybe 6 months, maybe 12 months. So essentially, they're doing almost anything they can to try and find a way to take that pain away, even if it means buying something in a less salubrious area, even if it means buying a unit rather than a house, even if it means paying more, because it's more about certainty versus uncertainty than almost anything else.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, that's something that you and I, we've talked about it before on the show, and I think that that's something that's been really underappreciated as a driver of demand and the current bounce in in prices. Because if you look at it over time as to when this has started to feed in, I think that that there is a fairly strong argument to be made that that the high migration numbers and the exacerbation of the rental crisis have really played a role in that. And I think it's also worth noting that once you take that away, once you take that impetus and that urgency away, and you've also got the increase in stock on market compared with over the 5-year average in some markets as well. Well, I think by sort of like Q end of Q1 next year, if we do start to see the rental market reach a bit of more of an even keel, you've really got conditions that could see price falls really kick off again, especially if you do start to see a bit of more of an economic downturn, driven by things like rising unemployment.
Absolutely, and I will just mention that the Bank of Mum and Dad demand seems to have upticked again. It's just turned again, right? So that'll be something else to watch, because first-time buyers looking to get help, and parents who are feeling a little bit more comfortable because they're getting more income from their savings because interest rates have gone up and the stock market has done quite well and property prices have sort of evened or gone slightly higher. So I think there's another factor there that's worth tracking as well.
No, I agree. Now, this is just a bit of an interesting one. It just shows when the Bank of Japan abandoned its 0.5% target. And what we have here in the different colors, in the orange is the US 10-year, in the blue, the US 20-year bond, and in the yellow, the German 10-year. And it basically just shows that once they abandoned that mark, bond yields started to rise. And I don't think that we are, bar some sort of, meltdown or some sort of more serious global slowdown, bond yields could still go higher from here. And it's going to be very, very interesting to see where that new equilibrium is found, because that has an impact on, well, basically everything. It's the thing that underpins valuations and everything from stocks to you name it. But there's also the fact that if we do see continued pressure in bonds and this spreads to the short end, we could see further rate rises in the US. It could put more pressure on the RBA. And even if it doesn't put direct pressure on the RBA, it could put pressure on the Australian dollar, which indirectly puts pressure on the RBA.
Right, and just bear in mind, of course, the higher bond rates means that the governments around the world who've borrowed big have actually got to pay more back in interest ahead, which means they've got less to spend on other things, which means that it puts pressure on their finances as well as, of course, the pressure on corporates who, in some cases, will be having their funding rise, and that's going to have a depressive impact potentially on some of the high-tech stocks that have actually done very well recently. So that could have a flow on into the broader markets too. So these bond trends are really, really important to understand. And I agree with you. The chances are, I think, that we're going to see higher rates in the bond sector, and probably more rate rises from some central banks. So I can't think that we're at the end of that hiking cycle. And then the other point is, Tarek, not only will they potentially be higher, but also higher for longer. And it's the for longer bit that I think is the really, really critical takeaway from here, because markets were thinking, central banks are going to reverse and cut rates again very soon, so it's got a little peak and then down. No. If you look at most of the forward projections, they're now saying higher for longer. And that for longer means that interest rates stay high, which means you have to pay more on the money that you're borrowing, whether you're a government or whether you're an individual. And that's the thing that ultimately I think could have a significant impact into the medium term. And that will, I think, be the one to watch.
And I think that is a very nice place to end in terms of this slide and the higher for longer. Because what possible reason could the Federal Reserve have to cut interest rates if the US economy is growing at an annualized rate of almost 6%? The answer is zero. Unless the wheels absolutely fall off, there's no reason for them to cut. And I think it's just worth noting that the RBA has never kicked off a major hiking cycle in history unless A, the cash rate was significantly higher than the US federal funds rate, or B, the US kicked off the rate cut cycle first, or was just about to, and everybody knew it. And we are nowhere near that yet. So the RBA is well and truly trapped in that regard. If our economy goes down the gurgler and the US economy performs well, we are properly in trouble.
No, I agree. And of course, this is an annualized quarter number, so you've got to be a bit careful with it. But everything that I'm seeing is along the lines that the Fed may even go higher. Interesting to see what happens at Jackson Hole over the next little while, or at least not cut. And if they don't cut, then you're right, the RBA is completely out of position. They got nowhere to run to.
No, they don't. And the reality is that, I mean, we saw the dollar hit like 63.9, 63.8 recently. And, even CBA is now talking up the idea of the Australian dollar hitting 60 or below, and that putting upward pressure on inflation. So not only are they potentially in a position where they can't cut, they're in a position where if things really go south in terms of the currency, they may be forced to step in and raise rates to protect the currency. So, I mean, I don't think that's a terribly likely scenario, mostly because that's not where their priorities lay. But at the end, because, housing market, but it's possible.
Yeah, it is possible. Yeah, and the other point to make just on the US, of course, the markets were assuming a recession, and they were assuming because of a recession that the Federal Reserve would then start cutting rates quite quickly. That was the sort of the logic, right? But because they haven't got this recession, the expectation of recession has been pushed out and pushed out and pushed out, and they're now talking about the perfect soft landing on those sorts of things. There's no reason for the Fed to cut. So higher rates for longer, despite the fact that it's going to cost governments a lot more, and households and businesses and everybody. And I have the view, Tarric, that we've gone through a period where rates were artificially depressed to zero. Well, it went negative in some places. But that will be seen as a sort of a one-off situation. I think we're going to be back to a more normal level. And it's worth just reflecting the average cash rate in Australia, and the average mortgage rate in Australia is sort of approaching where we are now or slightly higher. So that's worth just factoring into people's thinking. And by the way, if that's true, and you then apply the normal borrowing parameters to that, borrowing power will remain crimped. That will actually reduce the access to credit, and that can put downward pressure on home prices. Again, another reason why I still think home prices have downside risk in Australia.
Well, I think, just, taking a step back and looking at that negative gearing chart from a few slides ago, the Parliamentary Budget Office, when they did their forward modelling for the next decade, assumed a cash rate of 2.85%. Now, I think that raises an interesting question. Does that mean, is that their baseline of roughly where they think things are going to be? And if so, okay, 2.85%, it's not much, relative to history, and it's probably a bit too low relative to history. But I'd say it's just about where the RBA and where the politicians would like it, if that's as low as you could reasonably go. So if that's the case, and if that's sort of like around, sort of where the floor might be, and it arguably, that's, a relatively normal cutting cycle from where we are now, I think that raises an interesting point, because today's property prices are not reflective of a 2.85% cash rate.
No, they're not. Absolutely right. And if you look at the borrowing power issue and the debt to income ratios, we're still way higher than they should be, and way higher than people can actually cope with long term. Which is why I still think that there's more risk in the property market than many people are seeing at the moment. And I come back to this point, and I made this point with Edwin on, I think it was Monday. If you look at some of the property portals and what people are writing, they're talking very narrowly about property value, etc., etc. But this broader context that we're talking about is so important to understand, because it will ultimately play into where property prices go to.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, if the US economy powers, we've got a problem. If the Chinese economy doesn't power, we've got a problem, And if both of those happen, we've really got a problem.
Absolutely right. Well, we said that this was going to be an interesting conversation, and we've touched about 5% of the of the thematics that we could have. But anyway, I think that was a really interesting perspective, because it gives you the context for some of the decisions that may or may not be taken, and the risks. And I guess my takeout, Tarek, is Australia's economy is more exposed than perhaps most to some of those international plays, particularly because of where we currently are. And therefore, our fate is not our own. Our fate is very much what happens in some of the other countries.
Yeah, we are very much, a passenger in all of this. Whatever, if China doesn't stimulate, or if they choose a different path to stimulate, and if the US doesn't cut rates, yeah, it's going to be. Oh, I will say one thing though, it is going to be absolutely fascinating to watch.
Well, that's why we can come back in a couple of weeks and do another show, and there'll be more data and it'll be different and plenty to talk about. Tarek, I appreciate your time today. Thanks for the charts as always. We'll put the links and things below, and I look forward to doing it in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to it. I'm sure there'll be far too much to talk about all over again.
I'm sure there will. Have a great weekend. See ya. Take care.
You too. Have a great weekend, viewers.